Hello, everyone. Welcome to How to Read Chinese Poetry podcast. I'm Zong-qi, the program host. In this podcast program, my colleagues and I aim to introduce cutting-edge scholarship on Chinese poetry to a broad general audience. We will present 52 episodes covering the major poetic genres developed over China's long history. Each episode features close reading of one or more of the best-known Chinese poems, with an aim to illuminate their literary greatness and cultural significance. For all the discussed poems, Chinese text, English translation, romanization, and brief notes are provided at our website, howtoreadchinesepoetry.com. By following the 52 episodes, listener will gain a bird's-eye view of the thematic, formal, and generic evolution of Chinese poetry from antiquity to the modern era. Instruct and delight is what we wish to accomplish in each talk. Without further ado, let's begin. Today, we are presenting the inaugural episode of our podcast. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest host, William Nienhauser, Professor of Chinese Literature at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Let us warmly welcome Professor Nienhauser.
The Book of Poetry, an Introduction and Poems of Marriage. The Shijing Book of Poetry, or Book of Songs, because all of these things that we call poems today were originally songs, or the classic of poetry. It's known by many names, but I will call it the Book of Poetry in what I have to say to you. It's the fountainhead of Chinese poetry. By that I mean it is first and foremost the oldest anthology of poetry. The 300-odd poems that make up this anthology are the earliest extant Chinese verse, originating from the 11th through the 7th century before the current era. These 300 poems are divided into 3 sections. Sometimes people consider them to be 3 subgenres, and they are, in their presumed chronological order, the song, or hymns, the ya, or odes, divided into da ya, greater odes, and xiao ya, lesser odes, and the feng, or airs. There are 3 subsections of hymns, actually. Those of the state of Lu, those of the Zhou court, and the pieces imitating those of the preceding Shang dynasty. So the period we're thinking about is from roughly 1050 till the end of the 8th century, and when these poems were compiled. And this is the heyday of the Western Zhou dynasty. Lu, of course, is the small state that Confucius came from. The greater odes are concerned with the Zhou kingdom and with its conquest of the Shang. And the lesser odes are often connected to various regional courts of the states under Zhou control, like the poem we'll read in episode 3. The airs, sometimes referred to as airs of the states, guofeng, are broken into 15 sections, 13 ascribed to northern states or places, and 2 purported to be collections of songs of the southern regions under the Zhou rule. The Book of Poetry also provided a rich source of allusions. Later poets would include a phrase from one of the 300 poems and would expect readers to understand what they meant in light of the original poem. In other words, poets throughout Chinese history knew these poems virtually by heart. If you didn't know them by heart, you would miss much in the hundreds of thousands of poems written by subsequent poets, many of which had some connection to this first anthology. Scholars through the years have identified three basic figures or modes of presentation in the book of poetry. Fu, or exposition. We could think of this as the closest thing to narrative. Bi, comparison, often metaphors. And Xing, elusive, difficult term to explain. It's usually translated as effective or evocative imagery. And there are arguments about what it really means, how it works in poems. Although we have little evidence concerning the conditions of compositions, it seems clear from the poems themselves that the hymns and odes, so that's the latter two sections, were probably composed at court. Tradition tells us that the airs were originally folk songs collected from these 15 regions that I mentioned above and brought to court, where they were first standardized in language, because each of these 15 regions must have had their own dialect, and second, standardized in terms of prosody, so that they could be played at court. These folk songs were composed in a social setting that predated Confucian mores. Thus, liaisons between unmarried young men and unmarried young women were not only allowed, but encouraged, as we can read in a text like the Zhou Li, the Zhou ritual. This in turn resulted in many love affairs that ended in disappointment and despair, especially for the young women involved. Many of the airs are therefore plaints, apparently sung by these abandoned lovers. The airs also contain most of the best-known poems, some of which will be our focus today. Some of the poetic elements, the prosody of these songs, may have been the creation of the young men and women who originally sang the songs themselves. They had studied a certain tradition of how to sing, and they must have all had their own styles. Perhaps these were in part determined by popular tunes associated with certain affective images or evocative images. Those are the Xing. So some of the Xing, which are usually presented at the start of the poem, may have keyed the singer in to use a certain tune, or they may also have keyed the singer into using focusing on a certain theme or content. For example, a poem that had the line, "On the mountains there is X," was usually employed in a song about separation. All the poems, the 300 poems, are referred to by their title, but also by their number in a standard edition. So poem 115, titled "On the Mountain There is a Thorn Elm," reads, "On the mountain there is a thorn elm, on the low ground the white elm. You have long robes, but do not sweep or trail them. You have carriages and horses, but do not gallop or race them. When you are dead, someone else will enjoy them." So I'm assuming that the persona here, the person who speaks, is a young woman speaking to her lover. It's the first of three stanzas that I read to you of this poem, where the woman laments not only her lover's failure to govern, but by implication to his treatment of her. Perhaps the final couplet then is the stern warning: "When you're dead, someone else will enjoy me." The poem, however, like many, is open to various interpretations. The poetic standard seen here, the opening affective image, or Xing, which stirs the listener to expect a poem of separation and a sense of disappointment, were no doubt found in the original song, but refined by court musicians who helped shape these songs before they took their final form in the late 6th century BC. Although today the origin of the collection is considered to be unknown, traditionally it was thought that Confucius compiled the book of poetry after examining 3,000 poems, from which he selected 300 for inclusion in the book of poetry. That is possible, but it's also possible that there are many different versions of the same song, sung by different singers in different locations, just as we see in folk poetry in many cultures. So when we get to the poem in the second part called Qiangzhongzi, we can imagine that there must have been all sorts of versions of that. And we just have one version that the either Confucius or the unknown court compilers left for us. Most of the poems in the collection have a 4-word line, a 4-line stanza, and they almost all are multi-stanzed. They have various formulas or images which were associated with specific topics. Generally, the rhythm of the line is 2-2. So in later poetry, we find 2-3 and different rhythms, and even in the Shijing, there are variants with regard to rhythm. Usually there are rhymes on even lines, and the use of tropes like metaphor, simile, synecdoche, puns, onomatopoeia, rhyming, reduplicative compounds, alliteration, and puns are all found. Parallelism, especially in stock phrases such as we saw above, in on the mountains there is X, in the lowlands there is Y, is quite common. Although there are no fixed syntactical rules, the pattern of a topic introduced and then a comment on that topic, as found in much later Chinese verse, is also evident in the book of poetry. Finally, it has been argued that there may originally have been some significance to the sequence of the 300 plus poems within the collection itself. So there are actually 305. Some of them exist, a few with just title. Whether such significance existed, in other words, whether poem 40 has something to do with poem 41 and poem 39, can be seen, whether that can be seen in the extant text is difficult to determine. Yet it's clear that often reading one poem in the context of the poem which precedes or follows leads to insightful understandings. Many of the texts, especially the love songs, need little interpretation. Yet through centuries of oral and written transmission of these 300 songs, lines and even whole stanzas have been rearranged or lost. The situation is admittedly not as serious as with the Greek poetic fragments of the same period, where we find puzzling little snippets, such as Archilochus' fragment. He lived around 650 before the current era. All we have of one of his poems is the following: I hope that the dog star will wither many of them with his piercing rays. Who many of them refers to is unclear, but the clarity of the poet's enmity for these people, or for them, allows this pattern to resonate even with modern readers. Don't we all have someone we would like the dog star to pierce for us? Or another 7th century Greek poet, Alcman, has a fragment 82, which reads, the girls sank down helplessly, like birds beneath a hovering hawk. That's the whole poem. It's almost like a haiku. What's the context here, though? Without more of the poem, if there was more of the poem, or a commentary, it remains difficult to say. Yet the sinister image of the hovering hawk and the vulnerability of young girls lying helpless appeals to us across time. Many of the poems collected in the Shijing also lacked context and puzzled readers. One such song is Zhulin, number 144. It reads,
The Grove at Zhu. Why are you in Zhu Grove? Have you followed after Xianan? I've not gone to Zhu Grove to follow after Xianan. I drove my team of 4 horses. I rested in the outskirts of Zhu. I teamed my 4 colts and breakfasted in Zhu.
Why are you in Zhu Grove? Have you followed after Xianan? Then another speaker, I have not gone to Zhu Grove to follow after Xianan. I drove my team of 4 horses. I rested in the outskirts of Zhu. I teamed my 4 colts and breakfasted in Zhu. Like the Greek poems we saw above, the reader seeks a context for this song. Although the poem could simply be a love song about an anxious suitor or an anxious female lover who's trying to find out why her lover has gone somewhere, the references to the historical figure Xianan have caused most readers to identify the context of this poem with the affair between Duke Ling of Chen, who ruled from 613 to 599 before the current era, and Xianan's mother, as portrayed in the early Chinese historical text Zuozhan, the Zuo commentary. There, we learn that after continuing to see Xianan's mother for some time, the Duke insulted Xianan while they were drinking together. After the feast was finished, Xianan shot and killed Duke Ling with an arrow. The song was written, it is said, to satirize Duke Ling's improper behavior. It is the Duke who drove to Zhu. His impatience seems to have driven all night, as well as the erotic associations of the groves. Groves were places where romantic liaisons often took place. The racing colts, the horse as a fertile sexual symbol, and even eating breakfast. The many modern Chinese scholars, such as Wang Yiduo, have pointed out that shi, to eat, in the Shijing often has sexual connotations. So all of these things only heighten the Duke's impropriety, even as he tries to excuse it. The thematic style and the run-on lines of the final stanza suggest the Duke's urgency, because the poem, these last lines could be read quite quickly. There's no problem with any sort of stops, and they just flow along. As fascinating as this kind of interpretation might be, many of the great poems of the Book of Poetry either provide their own historical background or need no contextualization, as we can see in Tao Yao, number 6, the Peach Tree Tender.
The peach tree tender. The peach tree budding and tender, vivid and bright its flowers. This girl is going to be married and fit for her chamber and house. The peach tree budding and tender, quite large its fruit. This girl is going to be married and fit for her house and chamber. The peach tree budding and tender, its leaves luxuriant and lush. This girl is going to be married and fits with all in the family.
So this poem is an epithalamium or a marriage poem. This epithalamium is built around the comparison, B, between the bride and the peach tree. She is also budding and tender, vivid and bright. The peach itself has associations in traditional China with female fertility. But here, the emphasis is on the bride's suitability for the husband and for his entire family with whom she is going to live. The flowers refer to her beautiful face that will be important for her husband in her chamber. Thus, the precedence given to chamber over house in the last line of the first stanza. In the second stanza, the implication is that her body will be capable of producing many sons, as the peach tree, many peaches. And this, of course, is the main concern of her parents-in-law, who are represented in synecdoche here by their house. By the third stanza, the emphasis has moved from flowers and fruit to the leaves of the peach tree, suggesting the passing of seasons from spring to fall. The abundance of leaves and the slightly revised structure of the second line. Here we have the adjectival reduplicative, luxuriant and lush, which follows the noun leaves, so heavy alliteration, suggests the children this bride will produce for the family. The lush leaves may also foreshadow a good relationship with the couple, as the image does in several of the other airs. The rhythm, tetrameter or 4-word lines, and the rhyme scheme, XA, XA, XB, XB, where X's are non-rhyme lines, and finally XC, XC, is perfectly regular, underlying the theme of the poem expressed in the first line. The bride will fit with all in the family, just as the overall standard structure fits the poem. This balance is structurally built into the poem, as in the distich, the peach tree budding and tender, vivid and bright are its flowers. Although there are other marriage poems in the book of poetry, actually songs related to courtship or to love lost are more frequent, as we shall see in the second episode.
Let's thank Professor Nienhauser for such a stimulating talk. We look forward to his presentation of the second episode next Tuesday. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Let's relax and listen to a reading of the poems in Mandarin.
诗经·陈风·朱陵。胡为乎朱陵，从下南。匪是朱陵，从下南。驾我圣马，睡于朱野。乘我圣驹，朝食于朱。诗经·周南·桃夭。桃之夭夭，灼灼其华。之子于归，宜其室家。桃之夭夭，有逢其实。之子于归，宜其家室。桃之夭夭，其叶蓁蓁。之子于归，宜其家人。